Hello, and thank you for joining me for this webinar. My name is Ella, and today we're going to be going through the second part of how to report student engagement and student outcome on the ILR. So this is part 2 of this presentation, so hopefully you have already watched part 1, but if not, then I would recommend doing that first so that this can then continue with your learning. So today we're going to look at some definitions of some key fields used in reporting student engagement and outcomes. We'll look at what the OFS uses these fields for, what we expect from providers when determining how to report these fields. We'll look at the evidence that we would expect providers to be keeping for these fields, and then we'll look at some common issues found from our audits, and then we'll go through some examples before looking at how you can improve the data quality for these areas. So the fields we're going to cover in this presentation are type year, the year of the student, so the year STU, fund lev and fund comp, and then finally the outcome and outgrade. So first of all, what do we at the OFS use this data for? So type year, fund lev and fund comp are all used in the allocation of funding. So it's really important that these are accurate so that we can distribute the appropriate amount of funding to your college. Year STU is used to derive the NSS target population. So we're making sure that we're picking up those students that are going to be in their final year of study. And then outcome and outgrade are used in a range of performance indicators, which is included on our access and participation data dashboards, and they're mainly used to determine the student's attainment. So let's go through each of those fields in turn in a bit more detail. So as explained in part 1 of this presentation, there are some key concepts that we need to make sure that we understand before then looking at the individual fields in more detail. So let's do a little recap of those concepts. And the first one is the concept of the academic year, but you might also hear it referred to as the reporting year. Now this is the year that runs from the 1st of August to the 31st of July the following year. Now, another concept that we need to make sure we fully understood is an instance. Now, an instance is a coherent engagement with the provider by a student who's aiming towards the award of one or more qualifications or of credit. And that instance is broken down into years of instance. And the first year of instance will begin when the student starts studying with you towards that qualification. And then the second and subsequent years will start on the anniversary of that original start date. So it's really key that we keep these in our mind as we go through looking at the individual fields. The first field we're going to have a look at is type year, and this identifies whether the student is on a non-standard or a standard year of instance. Now, when determining type year, this should reflect the planned activity for the year, and you should be looking at whether that activity falls within a single academic year or it spans across academic years. Now, students should usually have a consistent type year as they progress through their programme of study with you. So if they start on a standard year, they will more than likely continue to be on a standard year. And if they start on a non-standard year, they will more than likely continue to be on non-standard year for the remainder of their years. There are some occasions where this does change, and we will look into some examples of those. But as a general principle, students should usually continue on the same type year. Now, one thing to remember when determining type year is that it should not be changed to reflect a student withdrawing. So if a student withdraws partway through the year and that impacts potentially on their type year, it doesn't matter. Return the type year on their study intentions. So how do you determine whether a student is on a standard year or a non-standard year? So from this picture here, you can see the activity in the blue blocks. Now, the activity is for each year of instance is contained within that academic year, within that reporting year. Now, because of that activity being contained within the year, this student is on a standard year, so they would be returned as a type year 1. But obviously not all students' activity is within that reporting year. Now, some students might have activity that crosses years. So, for example, if a student was to start in January, their year of instance would run from January to December. And therefore, we are crossing that 1st of August boundary for the reporting year. And this student would therefore be recorded on a non-standard year and would be returned as type year 2. So as I mentioned previously, the majority of students will continue to keep the same type year for each of their years of instance as they progress through their course. But there are some cases where the year of instance may change for a student as they progress through their years. Now, this usually happens when the student is on a course that is of length that's not easily broken down into years. So, for example, a 15-month course. So the first year of instance would run from the start date, so 12 months later. So if the student was to start in, say, January, that year of instance would run from January to December. Now that activity is crossing that reporting year boundary, as you can see from the larger blue block in the picture. Now, as it's crossing that academic year boundary, this year would be a type year 2, it would be non-standard. Now, then the student progresses on to their final 3 months of the programme, and that 3 months represents a short year of instance. So it would start from the anniversary in January till when they complete their course in the March-April time. Now, that short block, as you can see here on the diagram, is contained within the reporting year because they completed it by the time that the 31st of July rolls round. So this short year of instance would actually be a type year 1 and standard year because it is contained within the year. So there is examples of where the type year can change. So it's to make sure that you are looking at each year of instance individually to make sure you are appropriately recording the type year for it. So the main issue is that the definition of type year is not understood. So it's making sure that you fully understood that concept before then trying to implement that in your data. And some good practice, as I say, is to assign it for the course. So all students on a course should have the same type year. So that's a good way of making sure that you're getting that data as accurate as possible. Next up, we have year stew. Now, year stew is the year number that the student is on since enrolling on their course that's leading towards their qualification aim. So when the student first starts their course and their first year, they would be year stew 1. And then on the anniversary of their start date, the year stew should increment by 1. There are a couple of things to remember when determining year stew though. Now the first is that it should not be incremented for periods of dormancy. So if the student has a year's break and then returns to study, you should pause the incrementation of the year stew when they take their break and then resume it when they return so that you're not incrementing it during that year that they are off. The second thing to remember is that it should be incremented when the student repeats a year. So if a student takes their first year, they would be year stew 1. And then they unfortunately have to repeat that first year. Now, although they are still in their first year, they have been with you for 2 years. So the second time they do year 1, their year stew would be 2. Fund lev. So fund lev indicates the level and the length of the course, and it's really key field for when we're determining funding. So the first part of fund lev is determining the level of the course, so whether it is an undergraduate or postgraduate qualification that the student is aiming for. And the easiest way to determine whether it is postgraduate or undergraduate is that If the normal entry requirements for the course is an undergraduate degree, then it would be postgraduate. If the normal entry requirements for the course are, for example, level 3 A levels, then that is normally an undergraduate qualification. The second part that the field is capturing is the length of the course years. Now, they can either be standard or long, and to be coded as long, the student is required to attend for 45 weeks or more within the year of instance. So if they're not required to attend for 45 weeks, then that means they are on a standard year. So those two together, the level and the length, make up that FundLev field. So it's important to maintain the evidence of how the level and the length of the courses have been determined so that you've got that clear audit trail. FundComp. So this is probably everyone's least liked field in the record. And that's because there's quite a lot of confusion about how this should be determined. Now, FundComp is recording the completion status for the year of instance that's consistent with the definition in HESIS. It is not the same as the definitions for comp status, which has to be returned for students as well. So the full definition is available in the HESIS guidance, and I would recommend that you go and read that, but we will just go through some of the key concepts here. So to be counted as a completion, which would be recorded as FundComp 1, a student must complete all the modules they intended to complete in the year within 13 months of the start of the year. So that means that it doesn't matter if they have a resit or something in the summer, as long as they have completed that module within the 13 months and they have completed all of the modules they intended to do. Now, when determining whether a student has completed a module, this is also very specific. Now, to complete a module, the student must either undergo the final assessment of the module or pass the module where it can be achieved without undergoing the final assessment. Now, the key thing there is about actually undergoing the final assessment. The student does not need to pass the assessment. They must just attempt it. So if it was an exam and the student turned up and wrote their name on the top of the piece of paper and then left, obviously they wouldn't pass that assessment, but they have attempted it, and that's all that they need to do to be counted as a FundComp 1 for that module. Now, some students will be on a year of instance where by the time you're returning the ILR, they will only be partway through the year, and therefore you won't know whether the student will complete their year or not. So for example, a student starting in February, their year would run from February to January. At the point you're returning the ILR in that September-October time, they're only part way through, and so you wouldn't know necessarily that they are going to complete or not. And in that case, a FundComp equal to 3 should be returned, which basically says that you are not yet able to determine the FundComp. Now, this should only be used where you are actually unable to determine the FundComp. If a student is on that course starting in February, by the time you get to the ILR submission date, if the student has withdrawn, for example, then you know for certain that they are not going to complete, and therefore they should be FundComp 2. Or if that student had an assessment that they did not attempt and there is no opportunity for that student to retake that assessment within 13 months, then again you know they're not going to complete, and therefore they should be returned as a FundComp 2. So make sure that the students being returned as FundComp 3 are students where you actually don't know whether they're going to complete or not. So to be able to determine FundComp, you're going to need quite a bit of information. So to begin with, at the start of each year of the course, you need to know which modules the student intends to complete. And then if the student changes their mode or their study intentions, you're also going to need to know their revised module intentions, so you can check that they have undertaken all that was expected of them. You're then going to need to know whether each of those modules was passed and the date that they were passed, so that you can check it against the 13-month rule. And then for any modules that were failed, whether the student attempted that assessment, so whether they turned up and wrote their name down on that exam. And again, you'll need to know the dates of those attempts as well, so that you can do that check against the 13 months. So you need to make sure that you're keeping sufficient evidence for all of these aspects as part of your audit trail. And from conversations with providers that we've had, the most straightforward way to do and collect all of this information is to record all of the module assessments that the student is due to take that year, and then the dates on which they submit those assessments or undertake that exam. So again, some common issues. FunComp definition is not understood, and that mainly relates to whether the completion is counted as a completion or not in relation to whether the student has passed the module. Now remember, they do not necessarily need to pass the module to be counted as a completion, they just need to have undertaken the assessment. And again, we find insufficient details of assessment attempts available to derive FunComp, which then leads to incorrect data being returned. So some good practice: make sure that your staff have had some really good training on the definition of FunComp so they can determine it appropriately. Check those FunComp 3 students are actually students where you really cannot determine the FunComp for them, so those non-standard years. And make sure you're recording the students' assessment marks really clearly so that you can differentiate between non-submission and fails, or students that submitted but got a 0. Okay, up next is outcome, and outcome indicates whether the student has successfully achieved their learning aim that they were studying for, whether they've achieved a partial qualification, or whether unfortunately they've had no success. Now, this field cannot be updated until you've had your award boards, but we need to make sure that the details from those boards are being put into your student record systems promptly to enable the field to be completed accurately. Now, there are 3 valid entries for this field: that the student has fully achieved the aim that they were aiming for, that the student has unfortunately not received a qualification, or that the student has achieved a partial qualification. Now, the partial achievement, which is code 2, should be used to indicate where the student has achieved an award, but it's at a lower level than what they were originally aiming for. So, for example, if a student was aiming for a degree, but unfortunately they were only awarded a diploma in higher education, that DIP HE is at a lower level than the full degree, and therefore you would return a partial achievement code of 2. And again, with all fields, make sure you're keeping the evidence of these awards and non-achievements for all of the students, including the details from those award boards. And last but not least, we have outgrade. And outgrade is the examination grade that's been awarded for the learner for that aim. So we know whether the student has achieved their full qualification, they've received a partial qualification, or they have had no success. And this grade is capturing that overall result from their qualification. So along with the outcome, we need to make sure that this field is populated as soon as possible after those award boards to make sure that it is completed accurately. And again, we need to make sure that evidence from the award boards are kept as part of your audit trail. So here's a couple of examples of outgrade and outcome. So first of all, we have a student who completes their learning towards their higher education qualification in June 2020. The awarding body meets in September 2020 and awards the qualification. So outcome would be 1, and this should be returned to show that the learning aim was achieved, with the outgrade recording the grade awarded. Another student aiming for a HND is awarded a HNC when they leave the provider partway through their 2nd year of study. Now, as the HNC is lower than the HND they were originally aiming for, an outcome of 2 should be returned to show that they received a partial qualification. And the outgrade should still then be returning to record the grade that was awarded on that HNC. So looking at some common issues, and the most common issues that we find is that the provider is unable to evidence the award that was given to the student. So make sure you are maintaining that evidence from the award boards so that you have that sufficient audit trail for the outgrade and outcome that's being reported for the students. In terms of good practice, it's really important to make sure you've got those robust processes in place to update your student record systems as soon as possible after the award boards. So make sure those records of awards are being returned as soon as possible. And again, make sure you've got that evidence from those award boards kept for your audit trail. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the ways that you can improve the data quality in these fields. So some additional checks here that you could do internally to validate the data that you're returning. So do some comparisons between the type year and the learn start date that you are returning to make sure that the type year looks sensible. So again, your students that are starting later in the year and their year crosses that year boundary should be reported as a non-standard year rather than a standard. Do some checks to make sure that your year stu is incrementing each year for all of your students. Check where your fund lev differs for students on the same course. So all students on the same course should have the same fund lev. So any outliers, just check those to make sure that they are appropriately returned. Check to ensure that Fund Comp 9 is returned when students are not in the HESIS population. And that is appropriate. So the HESIS population is growing all of the time, so make sure that you are returning that appropriately. And check outgrade has been populated, so that often often gets missed from the return, so make sure that that grade is being inputted into the data. So we will also be doing some checks in our data checking tool to help you out as well. So we may raise queries where we see some unexpected type years. So again, basing that on those start dates. We might raise queries on unexpected fund comps. So again, based on the type year of the student, whether the fund comps look unusual. We'll look at unexpected fund levs and unexpected outcomes and outgrades too. We will also do a year-on-year comparison to make sure that year stu is being incremented as we would expect. Well, that's it for this presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that it has been helpful. And hopefully you are now well prepared to be returning the student engagement activity and their outcomes in the ILR. Thank you.